Okay, so in part one, we were talking about at least two different theories that explain how people learn. We talked about classical conditioning and operant conditioning, right? And in this lecture, we're going to talk about a third way of learning, which is observation, right? Observation and modeling. Okay. So cognitive learning theories deal with ways in which consumers actually learn from each other about products, right? Products in general, services, whatever you're interested in. Now, the way the process actually works, it's by observing a certain behavior that usually the consumer thinks is valuable or useful, right? And the way that process works is first, the consumer focuses their attention on the behavior, right? Then the consumer stores that behavior in memory. It retains the information pertaining to the behavior. Then the consumer tries to reproduce that behavior, right? This is the production process part of the story, right? Where you try to model that behavior that you have actually observed in others. And the last stage is motivation, which is basically situational factors that enable you to actually try to produce that behavior that you have learned through observation. Okay, and we call this observational learning, right? This process. Now, how frequently consumers are observing and learning? The answer is all the time, right? And this actually starts really early in our life. This is how we learn most of the behaviors that we display. So this starts usually in the family. Okay, so like I think I've mentioned other times when I was talking to you guys are professional consumers, right? You start your training and learning as a consumer when you're really, really young. In fact, you start pretty much since when you're born, because we are surrounded by products and services and marketing related activities, right? So when do consumers start this process? Like I said, just from the beginning, and a lot of it takes place within the family, right? So the family is where a lot of the behaviors that you have learned and display have actually been built over time. So the structure that there is in the family and the way parents especially deal with their kids is absolutely central for how those behaviors are learned and to what extent they are learned, and how a lot of the decision-making process later is going to happen when it comes down to products, purchasing, using, and disposing, like we're going to be talking about. Okay. Now, there are different parenting styles, right? The book talks about three, right? Authoritarian, which is, let's say, more controlling, right? Where the parents are going to have more strict restrictions on what kind of products and services can actually be used, at what times, right? So you're only allowed to play video games, on the weekends, for an hour, for 2 hours, whatever it is, right? Versus other parents that are maybe more neglecting, which will be kind of like the other opposite extreme, right? Instead of very controlling and authoritarian, you have parents that will actually let their kids do pretty much anything they want, maybe because they are not around. So there is nobody there to set the boundaries, or maybe because if they are around, they have pretty loose boundaries to begin with, right? And then the third type, what the book calls indulgent, is kind of like a middle ground, right? Where the kids have some more freedom when it comes down to the products and services that they use, to what extent do they use them, when they are allowed to use them, etc. But the parents are around. It's just kind of like a nice balance in between. The authoritarian and neglecting are the two extremes in this continuum. And of course, this is going to have an influence and an impact in how that consumers actually socialize. Now, here you have some time frame. If you don't have kids, or maybe you babysit, or you have some younger siblings, and these are some of the milestones that kids will actually go through, right, when it comes down to decision making. I have 3 kids, right, and definitely they're heavily involved in our family decision making when it comes down to products, right? And it starts really early, right? Of course, observation starts right away, right? Kids are always paying attention to everything that you're doing. This is why it's a humbling thing to be a parent, because anything that you do, it's going to be reflected by your kids. They are observing you, they are watching you like hawks the entire time, right? And this starts right from the beginning. But pretty quickly on, they realize that if they ask for things, they will get things, right? In fact, they learn that pretty quickly by just crying when they are little babies, and that's how they get fed and changed, etc., right? And they just translate that learning to purchasing situations, for example, right? So you will go with your kids to the store, and from pretty young age, let's say a year and a half, 2 years, they will start asking for things, right? They will just point right at the object that they're interested in, like chocolate or whatever it is. So I'm sure chocolate will be one of them, or chips, and they will just tell you that they want. And if you don't give it to them, they'll start crying, right? So they're making requests even when they don't know how to speak, right? So that starts pretty early on. Then later on, what they'll start is they will start helping you choosing products, right? So when you are at the aisle in a supermarket with a kid, from pretty early on, they'll start showing you their opinions. They will tell you, oh, why don't we buy this one instead of that one, right? For example, my 10-year-old, he doesn't do it as much anymore, but he used to go all through the store asking us to buy everything, right? Because they just, they have their own opinions about what is the best grocery list, and they're gonna just let you know about it, right? And pretty soon after that, maybe when they are around 4 or so, although some kids are more precautious, I can't say that word properly, they start earlier, right? And they're going to start making purchases, right? Of course, you're going to have to help them, right? So typically you'd go with them to the store, maybe you give them some money, and they'll go to the clerk with the money, and it will be kind of cute. And if the clerk is nice, which they usually are, they will kind of try to help the kid, but you might have to help them with change or whatever it is, right? Because they still need help, so that will be an assisted purchase. And then from there on, they become independent consumers, and that starts pretty young. It depends where you live and what's typical and what not. But for example, when we lived in Europe, where you are within a walking distance from home to the store, unlike in the US, which may be a little bit more challenging, at least in the Richmond area, right? And a lot of kids will have a little bit of money in their pocket, and they'll just go to a little candy store that is literally a couple-minute walk distance from their home, and they will just make their own purchases. And this happens in an ongoing basis, right? So from here on, we're up to the races, and you know what comes next because you've been through this, right? Now, we've talked about perception and we talked about learning. Now, what are we going to do with that learning? The answer is we're going to store at least some of that information that we have learned and patterns that we have discovered in memory. So the reason why we do this is because we don't want to have to do the same thing over and over again, because, it's cognitively taxing to learn, right? So once that you have learned something, a pattern, a behavior that will be helpful for you in the future, what we do is we store it in memory. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that memory is formed, and what are the different types of memories, and how you get from one to the other. Now, when we're talking about memory, there are different processes that are happening in our brains to store that information. Okay. The first stage in that process is encoding. Encoding is when information, basically, it's put into the right format so that it can actually be stored by the brain. Okay, that is the encoding system. After the encoding process, what we're going to do is we're going to decide, well, the brain's going to decide where we're going to store that information. Okay, so it's going to be put from encoding into the storage stage. Now, what's going to happen is we're going to have two different types of storage. We're going to have short-term memory, and we're going to have long-term memory. And we're going to talk about a little bit how you go from one to the other in the next slides, okay? So you're going to have encoding, you're going to have storage, and then the last step in the memory system is the retrieval aspect. So once that you have decided to put that information into memory, what you're going to do is you're going to recall that memory at a certain point in the future. And the reason why you do this, like I've said before, is because it's more efficient and it's going to give you a better chance of achieving your goals, right? By having some information that you have already stored in the past be recalled to your attention so that you can just use it maybe for decision-making purposes. Okay. Now, in this whole process, what's going to happen is we're going to have a vast array of memories stored in our system. In fact, like we're going to see later, as far as we know, there is not much of a limit when it comes down to long-term memory. We can really store tons of stuff, but not every piece of information is going to be easily recalled anyway. So what you're going to have is you're going to have certain memories that are maybe easier to be retrieved. To be fair, we don't really understand perfectly how the brain functions. We have some theories about it. I'm going to discuss a couple of them in a couple of slides. But one thing that we know is that there are some memories that are a lot more salient than others. Okay, and one type of memories that are very salient, they are called episodic memories. These are memories that relate to some sort of event that was particularly relevant to our lives. Okay, typical example of that will be the day you met your wife, right? In my case, I remember very well. I was in Spain, right? It was my first week at a new job, and I was going to be working with my wife, but I didn't know her, right? And I remember very distinctly that day, right? And I don't remember what she was wearing, right? And we've been married for over 20 years now, so it's been a while. And we didn't get married right away, by the way. Okay, so episodic memories, and it doesn't have to be such an incredible event, but there are certain events that we might remember because they are important to us, and because of that, the memories associated with that, they kind of get burnt and they become more salient, right? Those are episodic memories. They're in a time frame, right? Another thing that happens, and this depends on people, is that there are memories that are stored in certain formats that are easier to retrieve. One of those formats is stories, right? And in fact, this is probably why before we had books, we have stories, right? This is how a lot of the knowledge is transmitted within the family and, across other bigger groups, right? So this idea of a narrative is particularly important when it comes down to memories, right? Narrative is essentially a description of something, but it could be a product or a brand, in the form of a story. And the reason why is because we remember stories. The stories are powerful, right? So if you can build a story around your product or around your brand, it's going to make it a lot easier for people to remember, and hence maybe, if the story is good, buy and interact with the product or the service. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some different memory models. Like I said before, we don't know everything that is to be known about memory. We've been studying this for over 100 years now, and we have learned some things, but let's just say the brain is still somewhat of a mystery. Actually, I would say a big mystery. So let's talk a little bit about types of memories. Like I was telling you before, there are several types of memories. We're going to make a distinction between three types. In fact, if you've been following the lectures that we've had so far, first we started talking about perception. And if you remember, in perception, we were talking about how there is the sensing part, and then you focus your attention to something, right? If you remember that part, well, this is going to mirror the memory aspect behind it. In fact, memory is what enables a lot of the perceptual aspects. First starts with perception, but that's going to be later stored in memory, right? So you're going to have sensory memory. This is something that is built into your system that enables you to gather the information, right? So as information stimuli keeps getting processed by our senses, our five senses, right? We're going to be able to hold for a short period of time that information into sensory memory. Okay. At this point yet, we have not focused our attention in it. Okay. So like we saw in perception, there is lots of this information that essentially hits our sensors and our brain quickly discards. Okay. This is why when you're driving, oftentimes you can see a car that is trying to pass you and suddenly you look in that direction, right? There is this idea of peripheral vision, right? All this information that is in your periphery that you're not looking straight at, still getting processed by your brain, but it has not crossed an attention threshold that enables you to really focus your attention to. You're still focusing your attention on, hopefully, the road ahead of you, right? If you're driving. But if something moves quickly in the periphery, you're going to shift your attention, right? So it's going to move from sensory memory to now focusing attention on it, which is going to have to cross one of the thresholds that we were talking about the other day, right? And it's going to go through an attentional gate that will basically enable you to focus your cognitive processes on it. And because of that, you're going to move it into short-term memory, right? Now you're going to pay attention to it, and because of that, it's going to go to a part of our brain that enables us to store information for working purposes. This is also known as working memory. If you ever hear about working memory, short-term memory, they're essentially the same thing, okay? At least for our purposes, right? And the interesting thing is, whereas sensory memory is really high capacity, but you can barely hold it for a second, maybe even less than a second, short-term memory, you can hold information there for, short-term memory, right? So a short period of time, maybe 20, 30 seconds, okay? But what is very interesting is, whereas sensory memory was almost unlimited, short-term memory is very limited. In fact, there are some papers that try to establish how much information we can encode in short-term memory. And if I remember the title right, I think it's 7 pieces of information plus minus 2, right? So if you're very good at memorizing things, maybe you can store about 9 things in memory, in short-term memory. And if you're not very good like me, maybe only 5, right? What do I mean by things? These are bits of information, things like numbers, okay? And there are some strategies that we use for enhancing our short-term memory. If you've ever tried to memorize a telephone number, for example, one thing that you will do is something called chunking. Chunking is putting digits together in a way that it's easier for us to remember multiple digits. Like, for example, if you have 2 4s together, you might say 44, and that's stored as 1 digit, even though there are really 2 in there. So that's 1 bit of information. And what this theory says, or what actually the empirical evidence says, is that we can only store about 7 or let's say maybe 9, if you're good, of these things, right? And then what we do is, if we rehearse that, if we keep processing it in our brain, we might make the effort of putting it into long-term memory. And the interesting thing is, whereas short-term memory is very limited, long-term memory, so far as we know, if there are limits, we don't know what they are. So it's almost unlimited. And what's interesting is also it's very, very long-term. And in some cases, it might be permanent for events that are episodic or very important. Okay, so let's say, using the right cues, you might be able to retrieve information that you have forgotten about. Like, for example, sometimes, you go back to the city where you were born, and you go by a restaurant that you used to frequent, and you smell, like, I don't know, the type of food that you used to eat, and suddenly, right, you retrieve from memory all these images or stories that you have forgotten, right? Because it's still stored in long-term memory, but may be hard to retrieve, okay? So we have 3 types of memory: sensory, short-term, and long-term. Now, we have a couple of theories that try to tell us how these memories are organized in our brains, okay? One of them is this idea of an associative network, right? And what this says is that you have some concepts in our brain, which are memories, right? And these concepts are related to each other, okay, in some way, right? It might have strong relationships or weak relationships to each other, right? So take products like McDonald's, right? So because we've been exposed to McDonald's many times, maybe through commercials, maybe you've eaten there many times, maybe your friends talk about it, right? What's going to happen is there's going to be a set of concepts associated with it, like maybe fun, kids, family, toys, clowns, food, Coke, right? There might be a bunch of concepts that you associate with the word McDonald's or the concept of McDonald's, right? And this could be images, right? Like the golden arches, or it could be smells, like the smell of fries, or it could be flavors, right? Like the salty ketchup fried combination, whatever that is, right? Or it could be some of the experiences that you have had related with the products or brands, right? Like, maybe when you were a kid, your favorite things was going to McDonald's because every time you got a meal, you actually got a toy. Now that we know classical conditioning, you have the meal, you have the toy, you put them together, guess what? If you're a kid, you're gonna love McDonald's, right? Is it because the food is great? No, it's because I get a toy every time I eat there, right? So, and these connections that are created in your brain, in this network of concepts, are gonna be weaker or stronger. And depending on which one of those concepts is triggered, maybe by an external event, like for example, you're driving down the highway, right? And you see a golden arch with a little sign on top says, I don't know, take exit 57, right? And what you're going to do is when you see that image, there are going to be all these other concepts that are going to be retrieved by your memory because they are associated in that network, right? So it's the idea that when one of these things gets triggered by maybe some external stimuli, like a commercial, but it doesn't have to be, it could be somebody talking about it. All these other concepts are also going to light up in your brain to a more or lesser extent, depending on the relationships that can have been built over time. Maybe using classical conditioning, maybe using operant conditioning, maybe just modeling, maybe because your parents used to eat at McDonald's all the time. And because of that, when you think about family, you think about McDonald's, right? Good. So what I'm trying to say with this is that this network of ideas that we have in our brains are such that from a marketing perspective, you want to create this constellation of associations for your brand. Hopefully positive associations that people are going to trigger every time they think about their brand. And because of that, if they're trying to achieve certain things like having fun or just getting a quick meal, they think about McDonald's, which is what you've been working on for, let's say, the last 80 years, right? Now, the idea of a spreading activation is once that you have that concept or that set of concepts in your brain, what's going to happen is one node of that is going to get triggered by some stimulus, like a commercial, like a free sample, for example. And so if somebody gives you a French fry from McDonald's, right, that's going to trigger, it's going to activate through that network, and it's going to spread, right? It's going to spread to the other concepts associated with it. Maybe you think fries, Burger King. You know what? In my case, I like the Burger King fries better than McDonald's fries, right? So when I try a fry, I might think about Burger King, even though there is a McDonald's commercial, right? And the reason why that happens is because in my brain, the concepts are related in a network, like we saw on the previous slide. And when one activates, when one comes to the forefront of my cognitive resources, it's going to spread to the rest. It's like trickling water through a network of pipes. Some pipes are going to be wide, and they're going to spread that water really easily to the next node, which is going to be another concept. And some pipes are going to be narrow, right? And because of that, even if one concept activates, the other ones may or may not activate. And of course, there's going to be all sort of knowledge associated with this. It's not all universal knowledge. It could be brand specific. It could be ad specific. So every time I hear the jingle for Intel, I don't know, I think about laptops, right? And maybe I also think about greedy companies because for several years, Intel has had a de facto monopoly in the personal computing business. Although now that's changing with AMD doing a much better job than they have in the last 10 years, right? But anyway, whatever associations we have, right? They might be ad specific, they might be brand specific, right? They will all help you with identifying the brand. And especially for us marketers, what we care about is that brand identification is associated with the meaning that the brand has for you. So it's not just that you remember the brand, it's that when you think about BMW, you don't just think about a car, you think about a fun car that is sporty to drive, right? So there is meaning associated with that has been built over time by creating these knowledge structures, right? And they could be positive or negative, by the way. So you will have some evaluative reactions in there. So when I think about BMW, yeah, if you've ever, by the way, if you've driven like an M3, for example, BMW M3, they are really fun to drive. So that's a very positive thing in my mind because I actually like driving. On the other hand, they tend to be very expensive to fix and very unreliable. Okay, so you could have competing evaluative reactions to the same stimuli. Okay, so you can have some positive things and negative things to think about from a evaluative perspective for the same brand. Okay. Okay. Now, when it comes down to learning, we're talking about how learning happens. We've talked about the different types of memory, and we've talked a little bit how these concepts are actually stored in your brain in the form of networks, and how some of the activation in one node can actually spread to others. Now, that knowledge that you're building, those memories, are going to be put together in different constructs. One is schemas, right? Schemas is essentially a framework that enables us to understand what's happening, and we build those schemas by experience, by doing something or seeing something. Okay, so for example, you are a university student, right? And there are a set of things that you expect as such because that's what university students do, right? So that you show up the first day, you don't know what to expect, you don't know how the registrar's office works, you don't know what classes you're supposed to take, you don't know who your advisor is, you don't even know heck that there is an advisor that is going to help you choosing your classes, etc. So all these how things work, this schema is put together for you over time after you've actually gone through the experience of being a student over time, and that's going to help you guide the decisions that you're going to have to make in your life. The same thing happens with products, right? And so the schema is basically an agglomeration of experience that enables you to create a framework that helps you decide how things work, right? And by things, it could be, education, it could be, I don't know, diapers, right? How to take care of a baby. And in the beginning, you have no idea. You don't even know you need diapers. Well, you'll find out pretty quick, right? And you don't know what diapers work and which ones don't, and how you need to clean the rear end of your baby, and what kind of cream you need to put afterwards if you don't want to have a rash, etc., etc., etc. What is a script? Script is somewhat similar to a schema. It's more concrete, and it's basically a set of events that you expect to occur. Like, for example, when you go to a restaurant, there is a certain script here in the US about what needs to happen, right? You get to a restaurant, and typically, unless it's a fast food chain, if you're in a sit-down restaurant, let's say, you're gonna get there, there's gonna be a host or hostess that is gonna, ask you, if you want a table, right? You will not find that in many other countries, right? But in the US, that is expected. It's part of the script, right? And after that, they will walk you through the table. Again, that's expected and part of the script. And then when you get to the table, you'll sit down, and then there will be a waiter or a waitress that will actually come and help you, right? So there is a set of events that you expect when you're at a restaurant, okay? And this is something that you learn through experience, like a schema. Okay, schema is a little bit more general, but it's kind of similar, right? This is how we store knowledge in schemas and scripts, okay? And of course, if you're designing a new service, like a new restaurant, understanding these scripts is absolutely central, right? What happens if you want to, for example, simplify this, right? The idea of fast food restaurant is fascinating if you think about it, right? What makes fast food restaurant is the fact that, you can get the food almost right away. In a traditional restaurant, you might have to wait let's say between 15 and 30 minutes from the moment you walk into the restaurant, assuming you don't have to wait for a table, until you actually start eating food, right? And the idea of circumventing some of these steps so that you can actually get to the food faster, it's a service innovation. So if you understand these scripts, right, you might be able to use that to your advantage if you're trying to provide some sort of value that is not present in the marketplace to your consumers, for example. Okay. So we've talked about memories, we've talked about encoding. Now, the last step in the memory process is this idea of retrieval, right? And the idea behind it is the reason why we keep memories is because it's gonna be helpful for us to leverage or access those memories in the future so that we can actually make decisions either better or faster or both, right? So the retrieval of information is useful because it helps us with decision making in the future. And the difficulty with retrieval is that sometimes accessing those memories might be hard, right? How many times, I don't know if this happens to you, it happens to me, maybe I'm getting old. How many times I put my phone somewhere and I don't remember where I put it, right? So I know I put it somewhere in the house, I just don't know what it is. So I'm trying to rack my brain, trying to retrieve the memory of where I put my phone down, right? And sometimes cues are useful for this, right? Cues are basically external stimuli that are going to help you identify those memories in the long term and retrieve them easier, right? What kind of cues could you be using? Well, you can use imagery cues, right? These are certain images that you can think of. So for example, if I'm thinking about putting my phone down, what I might try to do is, shuffle through images in my brain of what was I doing when I was using the cell phone last, right? And I'm hoping that that cue of what was I doing, was I answering an email, was I browsing the internet, was I watching a YouTube video, what was I doing, to see if that cue is gonna help me retrieve the memory of where I put it down, okay? Cue could be something like smell, right? Smell of pizza, right? It brings you back to your old memories of when you used to eat pizza with your grandpa on Sundays, whatever, right? You get the point, right? So you can access a memory, and something that can help you access a memory is going to be a cue, right? Cue. Nice. And like I was talking before about accessing memories, there is also forgetting, okay? So just to keep us sane, and sometimes because we need to make space or the information is not so useful, what we do is we forget, right? And the way forgetting happens is when that information we are either not exposed to the same pattern, or we don't observe the same behavior. It can decay over time, right? The idea that, something that happened a week ago, a year ago, if we don't see the same patterns repeat, if you don't see the same commercial, if you don't have exposure to the brand, that information in your brain is going to decay and you're going to start forgetting about it, right? There might be some cue later that helps you retrieve that information, but unless you do that, it will die down, right? There is also some new information that can come in that will take the place of the old one, right? So maybe you used to use Facebook before, but now you decided that you're tired of all the ads and commercials that Facebook is using, and because of that, you want to start using a different social network. I don't know if that's your case or not. And in that situation, it could be that one takes the place of the other, right? So there will be some sort of interference, right? It could also be that depending on what was your state when you were making the memory, you are more or less likely to remember it. Like, for example, if you were going out with your friends and maybe you guys were having fun and having a few drinks, it might be that you're more likely to remember a certain event if you get a few drinks again, okay? And so it could be that for you to retrieve the memory, you need a cue. In this case, it could be an external cue like alcohol, for example. It doesn't have to be only alcohol. You have a joke on that here on the slide, right? It could be anything. It could be temperature, right? It could be in a very hot environment. You remember something because it was hot before, etc. Okay. Salience, I've already talked about this in the past slides. Salience is how active a memory is in your long-term memory. Okay. So it could be that some things are very salient. And the interesting about saliency of memories is that it varies over time, right? There are cues that will trigger salience within memories, but there are some memories that are more salient than others. Like, for example, episodic memories, like I was saying before. Okay, good. And then there is the von Restorff, I cannot pronounce that word well, effect, right? Which says that anything that makes a stimulus more new or novel it's going to help improving recall, right? So anything that makes a stimulus that you're exposed to more novel, it's going to make it easier for you to retrieve that information at a later time. And if you follow this concept, one thing that you can do, for example, when you're creating advertising, is instead of having an advertising that only talks about the positives of a brand, which is a very typical technique, those are called polar ads, you can use mixed ads that point some of the positives and negatives of the brand, right? So despite the fact that we are maybe not the best-selling car in the market, so that will be a negative, right? We still offer the most, bang for your buck, right? So this idea of having like a mixed message that talks about both positive and negative emotions might make it more novel because it's unusual, right? And because of that, you are more likely to recall that ad than if it was the typical more, or less, right? Now, how do we measure memory in consumers? There are specific techniques that psychologists, for the most part, have developed, and consumer researchers, which borrow heavily from psychology, to measure memory. There is a heavy distinction here I want to start with, which is this idea of recognition versus recall. So, for example, if you ask people about brands, so what brands you know, what restaurant brands of fast food do you know? And if you ask just like that, that is called recall, right? So you give them an empty list and they have to write down the names, and they'll tell you McDonald's, Subway, whatever, right? I don't eat much of fast food restaurants, so maybe I'm not the best at recalling which one the names are. On the other hand, and this is a more stringent test of memory, asking for recall. The other hand, you have recognition. Recognition is you give a list of restaurants to a person and you ask, which ones of these have you heard of? And you're going to notice pretty quickly that people are going to recall a lot less brands that they're going to recognize. So if you're going to use both techniques to measure how knowledgeable somebody is about a topic, please always ask for recall first and then recognition, because otherwise, obviously, you're going to get biased results, right? Because people are going to remember what you give them in the recognition test, and then you ask them for recall. It's like, yeah, I remember what you said before, right? You showed me these names. So I'm going to write them down, even though I will not have remembered them otherwise. Okay. So this is how you measure whether people have built these memories, for example, when it comes down to brand recognition or brand awareness, which is something that as a marketer, you're going to be interested in for sure. Okay. Now, the difficulty with memory is that like measuring anything, there are problems or measurement issues, okay? And they arise for multiple reasons. One is because people tend to have response biases, right? So if you show people a laundry list of 17 restaurants, they are going to say that they recognize more restaurants than they actually do because they tend to check on the same box. That's a response bias, right? Just because you're checking on the same box, you're going to check more likely on the following box that says, yes, I remember this restaurant, even though you've never seen that restaurant before. Okay, that will be a response bias. Okay. Also, you're going to have memory lapses, right? Especially the older you get. And that means that, you're going to omit facts, right? So things that you should remember, you will forget. Okay. And even if you remember things, you're going to remember them inaccurately. This is what happens with averaging. For example, if you ask people, on average, how many, pizzas they eat a week, right? What people will do is they will basically remember values on the average, but they will discard from their memory extreme cases. Like, for example, 1 week they eat pizza every day, right? Or every dinner. They're going to forget that week and they're going to think mostly about not the outliers, but the typical days, right? So because of that, the values you're going to get because of this averaging are going to be inaccurate. Okay, the extreme cases where you eat tons of pizza don't compute for the consumer, and because of that, they're going to tell you that they eat less pizza than they actually do. Okay, another thing that people do a lot is telescoping. That's when you move the time frame when the actual experience happens. So you think that, the time when you went to, I don't know, a resort in the Caribbean, it was last year, but it was really 2 years ago. It just happened that 2020 was so long that it sure feels like 2 years have gone by, even though it was only 2019 when you actually went in the summer to the Caribbean. Okay, this effect of shifting the time frame is called telescoping. Okay, and then the last one that it's somewhat interesting, and there are many other effects like this in the literature, is the illusion of the truth effect. Just because somebody tells you that something did not happen, the fact that they told you that, especially as time flies, and maybe that memory is less salient, the fact that they told you something about it, it's going to make it more likely that you think that it did actually happen, even though what they told you is that it did not happen. So it's like the no goes away, and the fact that remains more salient is the actual fact. So because of that, you have this illusion of truth effect. So consumers tend to report things that they were told were not true as true, which is kind of a problem if you think about it, right? To summarize what we have discussed today, we've talked about different models that show us that humans are very good at finding patterns, and when these patterns are seen over and over again, either because we're observing, or because we're giving rewards, or because two things are paired together, we learn, right? We identify that information as potentially useful and relevant, right? We learn from others, especially from our families, right? Especially when we are young. That's how we do a lot of the learning as consumers, and that's how we get initiated into the consumption process, okay? And then what we do with that information is we use that information to store it in memory, right? And the reason why we store it in memory is because those memories are going to help us make decisions about products, services, and pretty much anything in life, either faster or better, right? By not having to learn again. Although, we're constantly learning and we adapt or change some of the knowledge that we have created over time. There you go.